Welcome to That Can't Be Right, a podcast about exploring structural wrongs, cultural oddities, and wild opinions, sometimes all three in one episode. I'm your host, Rhian Rogan, and before we jump into the really good stuff, I'll share some highlights about me and why I was inspired to start this podcast in the first place. I explained a bit in the trailer, but I don't think people actually listen to podcast trailers, so here we go. I'm a young Black millennial woman born and raised in Houston, Texas. I have a degree from the University of Pittsburgh and another from UCLA. I know what a dial-up connection sounds like, and I've also been very annoyed when the internet on a plane was too slow for me to stream a Beyonce album. The average student loan debt burden has tripled since I was potty trained, and I've seen the success and failure of multiple women's professional sports leagues. I don't understand why we charge kids to eat lunch at schools they're forced to attend, but don't charge them to ride the bus. And hey, consultants, don't start telling school districts to charge kids to ride the bus. Companies are still offering unpaid internships. America has been at war in Afghanistan for nearly 2/3 of my life, but I'd wager a large majority of the US population couldn't find Kabul on a map. Beyonce has never won Album of the Year at the Grammys. Home ownership is a pipe dream for many in my generation. It was easier for me to purchase a handgun in Texas than it was to register a vehicle I bought in California. It's April 2021. Super rich people got way more super richer in the last year, while lines at food banks got way longer. Meanwhile, the US has a sub-minimum wage. College endowments are huge but untouchable, and I've seen videos of Black men and women murdered by the police, sometimes captured by the police officer's own camera. And every time I think to myself, that can't be right. How do we fix it? So I'm doing the research and asking the experts. I hope you'll join me. Follow or subscribe in the app you're using to listen to my voice. Check me out on Twitter and Instagram at TCBRPod. Let's jump into it. Welcome to That Can't Be Right, a podcast for exploring structural wrongs, cultural oddities, and wild opinions. I am your host, Rhian Rogan, and today we're talking about Hollywood. There is no business like show business. In March 2021, headlines hit all the entertainment magazines and their Twitter accounts. From Forbes, Hollywood loses $10 billion a year over a lack of Black representation. In Variety, similar, Hollywood losing $10 billion annual to racial inequality. And the LA Times chimed in, Black inclusion gap costs Hollywood $10 billion a year. That can't be right. So I skimmed the articles and determined that the report came from McKinsey & Company, a consulting firm and bastion of diversity in their own right, so I decided to read the whole thing. And I think if you only read the headlines or the Twitter preview, it seems like the problem is just not having Black people in the movies. And that absolutely is a problem, but there's more, and I really wanted to dive into it with a subject matter expert, Enter Jay Tucker. Jay is the executive director at the Center for Management of Enterprise and Media Entertainment and Sports at UCLA Anderson School of Management. He has 20 years of experience in marketing, education, and technology. He's a Stanford grad. He's a Columbia grad. He's a UCLA grad. And he is an alpha man. Jay, welcome to That Can't Be Right.
Thanks for having me, Rhian. It's great to be here.
Very excited. You're pretty plugged into the industry. I'm so excited to hear your thoughts. And we're going to go through the whole thing, not line by line, but kind of hitting the high marks. What were your initial thoughts when you first saw the headlines, read the articles, read the study?
So I understand the sensational nature of the headline, but I think, to a certain degree, our understanding of the size and scope of the entertainment business and the currency of culture, right? I think vastly undersells the importance of diversity and inclusion, right, in the business. And so I was not surprised by the number being thrown out. I understand how it's going to drive people's attention, but I think if you kind of go through and start thinking more about the linkages between kind of commerce, culture, and content, you start to realize that by not reaching out and embracing the multicultural kind of global audience that we have for entertainment, a lot of money is left on the table, for sure.
How do you feel about this pragmatic approach to racism? How do you feel about the idea of putting a dollar sign on the cost of racism. Because to me, racism is already bad. And I think you're right. Putting that dollar sign in front of it kind of sensationalize it. Does that make you feel icky at all?
I have mixed feelings about it, right? So I think um, for those of us who believe in quantitative analysis and believe that you can learn new things by running experiments and believe that sometimes the solution to a problem is not a silver bullet, right? The problem is not a werewolf, but it is lots of bullets. It's a really big dog. Um, then you start to ask yourself what happens if we're trying to shift opinion and shift behavior if we take multiple tactics, right? If we use multiple strategies to kind of make people aware of challenges in front of us and to get them invested, right? Um, it is true that there is a moral and ethical line of attack that speaks to our common humanity. In many cases, when we talk about these questions here in the United States, our common citizenship, our common heritage and culture, the founding principles of the country, e pluribus unum, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that having inclusion is simply the right thing to do. And you can't be um, a fully realized member of American society if you don't work to make our workplace, our communities, et cetera, more equitable and more inclusive, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, it is also true that there's a large segment of the population for whom that does not provide significant motivation, right? And when I say significant, in
Right.
this case, enough to change their behavior. And we know that we have had decades of study and intervention around issues of diversity, right? Going way back, I think really even to the 60s and 70s in the corporate workplace, but certainly like peaking in the 80s and 90s, which was the first time you really had, um, diversity departments in a large corporation or heads of diversity in a large corporation where people were actually trying to think about issues of race, representation, etc. Um, and it's clear that one of the avenues that motivates people to change their behavior is when we get into um, the financial impact in the workplace of
Mm-hmm.
representation and equity and inclusion and so on, right? We recognize that trying to reach global and multicultural markets can be compromised if you don't have that kind of inclusion. We recognize that corporate culture can become toxic, not just for people in underrepresented groups, but for the whole company if business leaders are not trained to be a little bit more sensitive and aware of the different stories that make up our modern American workplace,
Mm-hmm.
and the modern global corporation. When you start to frame issues that way in terms of, well, what's the impact on the bottom line? How successful can a company be if they don't embrace diversity and inclusion and so forth? That motivates a different segment of folks. I wish that we didn't have to talk about dollars and cents when it comes to basically recognizing, respecting, and including every human in our enterprise. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but I recognize that if we actually want progress, that we use every avenue of persuasion available to us so that we can. And I think it's inarguable at this point. There have been many studies. We're talking about the most recent studies, but just looking back at Professor Darnell Hunt's, actually Dean Darnell Hunt's Hollywood Diversity Report here at UCLA, you see that we have now 6 or 7 years worth of data specifically in the entertainment industry that tells a story about how you know having diversity makes projects more successful. And I think that approach where we can kind of point to actual data, looking at actual projects and showing people time and time again that this principle that we think involves getting people to do the right thing for our society will also yield the right thing for the business will take hopefully some people from leaning back to hopefully getting them engaged and involved and trying to do the right thing.
Okay. Thank you. I struggle with it as well. I think you laid out really good reasoning why you just have to use whatever forces you have available to try and get people over that obstacle of not wanting to include everyone. So thank you. I think that's an excellent start to this. So let's dive in. I guess we can start by providing a little context. report says Hollywood is a $148 billion industry. An industry, by excluding black talent, is leaving approximately $10 billion on the table. But it's not just on-screen talent, it's off-screen talent. But I do want to start with on-screen talent, because if you look at the top paid actors and actresses of 2019, of the great before, I don't know if 2020 will be statistically relevant in any studies moving forward, but I say 2 black people on here. Coming in at number 10, poor guy, Will Smith at $35 million. Number 1, if he wants to claim us, is Dwayne Johnson at $89 million. And that's it. For men and women. But again, it's not just on-screen talent. And I think the study explains, and as you explained, Hollywood has the same issue as every other industry in terms of inclusion. But we literally see it played out on screen. Whether it's, there's a lot of people, it's like a rainbow coalition, or it's Friends, right? So what were some of your initial thoughts in terms of the discussion about on-screen talent and then off-screen talent? Because I feel like this is one of the first studies I've read where it speaks to that as an issue as well.
Yeah. So I want to put a couple things in context. First, we talk about the entertainment industry and as big as it is, right? So somebody throws out a number, $100 billion, $150 billion, or people estimating, we kind of lump in all of the entertainment industry. Maybe it's $200 or $300 billion, right? That's a big, big number. But I want you to understand that when we talk about the economic impact of the transportation industry or the telecommunications industry or whatever, those numbers are orders of magnitude bigger. Right? That we're still, these are really, really big numbers.
Yeah.
But we're still talking about a very specific slice of the economy. I bring that up because what is often poorly understood is that entertainment is, in many cases, still a business to business enterprise. We have seen this massive shift to streaming and direct to consumer models where the customer pays for access to their entertainment library, whether we're talking about a subscription to Spotify so you can get your music, or a subscription to Netflix or whatever so you can get your video. That has led people to think that, the consumer is always directly paying. And the reality is that often it's actually distributors, brand sponsors, and other players that are actually really feeding that 140 something billion dollar, economic beast that is entertainment. And so off the top, if we want to talk about the impact of diversity, going back to what I said about reaching multicultural audiences, clearly diversity in front of the screen gives you potentially authenticity, engagement, and a broader subset of avenues to connect with and build with and collaborate with and get the attention of, different parts, different segments of the, of our society, of our consumers, right? And so just on its face, you should be very, very disappointed when you hear things like how difficult it is for successful female directors to get a second shot, how rare it is to see Asian leads in movies, how difficult it is for Black men and women, or their Latino counterparts, to get to that level where the most highly sought after celebrities or the most well compensated actors, performers, etc. Right? Like that should raise an eyebrow, because you start to recognize that, okay, there are these large segments of the community that we're not connecting with, and that's going to have downstream implications for the business, not just specifically at the box office, not just, when we talk about subscription revenues, right? But we're talking about merchandising, sponsorships, and all kinds of other stuff that's part of that ecosystem, right? And to say nothing about, the unsung minority in this whole conversation, which is people living with disabilities, right? Which is a huge portion of our population that gets ignored all the time. So certainly when we talk about what's going on in front of the camera, what you see reflected back at you. And then we start thinking about, these younger generations, right? So I'm a Gen Xer, but, we've got now probably the majority of consumers at this point are millennials and below, right? So millennials, what we would call Gen Zers, some people call them plurals and so on, and folks younger than them, they expect to see diversity. It's the world
Right.
they've grown up in. So this idea that you think you kind of manage a business or optimize a business without including them and without showing them images that they believe are credible and authentic, that's probably not going to work out in the long run. And I think when we talk about that 10 billion number, I bring up the larger economic ecosystem that entertainment sits within to just point out that I'm sure there's a way to look at the potential upside in the entertainment industry and the opportunity cost of not including diversity, and you might get an even bigger number, right? So that's in front of the camera. Now we come back to behind the camera, which goes to the question of how stuff is developed, which projects get greenlit, how distribution is handled, right? How folks market and promote different projects to reach certain audiences, and
Yep.
so on and so on, right? So we talk about everything that's not the creative piece, which is, the business part of show business. How do we get the show or the experience that you love or that we hope you love to you?
Mm-hmm.
That's the
Yep.
business part, right? And those people who are working in offices or out in the field, those people are the ones who ultimately are going to dictate whether or not you ever get a chance to see another Black Panther film, or Ma Rainey's, or Crazy Rich Asians, right?
Yep.
Without those people in the mix, these projects don't get greenlit, they don't get funding, they don't get traction. You never hear about them, right? And so there's a whole piece around, again, this is show business, around making sure that you're getting the appropriate return for the investments that you make that include diverse casts, diverse directors, producers, and so on, right? And
Yep.
so without having those people in the room, there's a whole bunch of opportunity that ends up getting, left on the table, left on the floor. And there's obviously the converse here too, which is sometimes things get greenlit and executed in a way that's suboptimal from a diversity and inclusion perspective,
Oh yeah. We have.
right?
Yep. Green Book, I think, is one that comes to mind immediately. There are others, but that's the one. That's one of the examples I had for sure. So let me jump in and let's go through that process you're talking about, because you've brought up a couple good points in that it's not just what's on the screen. There's a whole ecosystem around the movies and the films and television that we watch. So in the study, they laid it out, the pain points in each phase. There's a discovery phase, there's the decision phase, the development phase, the filming and production, and the distribution and release. So starting at the discovery phase, right, where these businesses, as you mentioned, it's business to business, as even though we might perceive it as direct to consumer, where are these businesses going to get people? Where are going to get their ideas, and how are they bringing these people on board? I guess I have two questions, right? So there's the decision phase. And one thing they mention is first look and overall deals often limit opportunity for creators in the space. Does that mean all of these, diversity and inclusion writing programs that I intend to submit my spec scripts to are a waste of time? Are those not a waste of time, but are they not as helpful as they might, as, just getting in naturally?
That's a great question, actually.
Yep.
So, two things. First, they're not a waste of time. We talk about the entertainment industry. The entertainment industry is this really unique beast because on the creative side, you're talking about trying to make a living selling art, selling love, basically. Even if
Mm-hmm.
we're talking about sports, ultimately, it's not the quality of competition on the court specifically, right? You're not necessarily compelled simply by athleticism. It's about allegiance to human beings and groups of human beings. It's about the joy that's generated in seeing somebody perform athletically in an artistic way. So even like kind of the original unscripted entertainment, which is sports,
Yep.
um, you can't really separate that emotional connection from the value that's created, right? So certainly writers programs and other things that provide a way in, not just in terms of giving you a reason and resources to start to hone your craft, but also to be part of the collaborative creative effort, right? Which is a thing that, I think again, isn't paid enough attention, right? Yes, there are some truly brilliant people that go out, for example, and write a book. If you're writing a book, shout out to N.K. Jemisin, right? Or Octavia Butler, other folks who've done a brilliant, brilliant job of building worlds with the printed page. If you're doing that, you have total creative control. The minute we
Hmm.
say we're gonna have $100 million, $200 million project to bring that thing to the screen, you know that it takes a village. And
Yep.
so understanding how to be not just a great writer, but to be part of a writer's room, I think that has value.
Okay.
But that's when you said, am I wasting my time? I don't think that's really what you were asking.
No, no, no.
Ultimately, there's two things that have to happen, right? We talk about luck is when preparation meets opportunity. Well, the writer's room provides the preparation. You still need the access to opportunity though, right? So again, if we're in the industry providing a platform for people to get trained up and skilled up and to be part of your talent pool, but you're then not green lighting Afrofuturists like Yatasha Womack or Tananarive Due, or other folks who are in the mix. We've got nowadays, we've got a number of folks, people of color who are getting into anime and other things that typically you would think are part of a particular cultural point of view. You have folks being really successful creators in these other spaces. If we're not seeking them out, going out and getting new source material and then bringing it to life so that we can leverage the skill set that we're training up in these special programs, then we're really missing an opportunity. I will also say that what I've seen, and it's not like I've seen research on it, but what I've seen just as somebody walking the earth and observing what's happened in the entertainment space. I remember when UPN was launched, which was a Paramount network that was launched on television.
Yep.
And I remember when we saw this explosion, of investment in new content, originals from Netflix and Hulu and, other platforms. And in both cases, the additional platforms to reach audiences created this kind of pull effect to get new content created. And in those cases, you saw that one of the first places folks went to were to communities where their stories are not always told.
Yep.
So you get, whether it's the sci-fi nerd or the very idiosyncratic Black culture of Atlanta, or if it's a story about women in a particular context where you don't normally see women, or whatever, you start to see things get greenlit in those situations that normally wouldn't have been part of kind of mainstream entertainment, right? And the successes of those projects actually kind of spur the success of the platform. And yet people don't always look at that as evidence that we need to make sure that that's part of a healthy entertainment diet, right? That's stuff that we should
Right.
all be doing across every network, every point of distribution. It's very, very interesting, right? When you think about how, whether we're talking about Insecure with HBO or Atlanta, or, I could go down a huge, long, long list of amazing, amazing titles. Orange is the New Black, where you see a particular culture highlighted, whether it's, again, based on gender, membership in the LGBT community, race, religion. You see that these things, when they're done properly and authentically, they hit hard. They get a loyal following well outside that particular community, and they
Yep.
can really change the perception of the brand. So the studio or the network that is associated with that project all of a sudden gets, cool points. Um, Nevertheless, up until this very interesting juncture in history, those successes haven't necessarily translated into more investment.
Yeah.
I think the most intentional organization I've seen in terms of the investment and this kind of virtuous cycle has been Netflix, right?
Yeah.
Um, but beyond that, I don't see Crazy Rich Asians getting Warner Brothers to do, 15 projects featuring Asian leads.
So I have a couple of thoughts. One, yes, I did not mean waste of time, but I did mean would it give you the right connections, right? So you answered that perfectly. Thank you very much. Two, I had notes about UPN in my notes preparing for this episode, and it felt like because I wasn't aware of like the creation of UPN, UPN just emerged as a place where I could watch Black sitcoms growing up. But it also felt like they were relegated to UPN because again, I'm watching The Parkers, I'm watching Moesha, I'm watching Girlfriends, all on UPN. The only other show I really remember watching with Black people that wasn't on UPN was My Wife and Kids. So I also have like a thesis that Hollywood really only allows like 5 Black people to be famous at any given time, right? So
That's bad news for me.
Me too, right? Like, you know the deal. So it's also interesting to watch like the ebb and flow and the contraction of Black talent on screen. You had the Cosby Show at the tail end of the 90s. You had all of those 90s sitcoms, Martin, Fresh Prince, Living Single. 2000s, you had UPN. And right now, we have Issa Rae, we have Atlanta, we have different shows like you were mentioning earlier. What do you think accounts for that like ebb and flow of interest in, Black stories or stories just from other communities, right? Because we saw Orange is the New Black, we saw Crazy Rich Asians, but like you're saying, it's not leading to an explosion. So we're going to wait a couple of years and then there'll be another story and they'll say, we have to tell more stories. And then someone else is going to record a podcast episode like this in 5 years.
So sometimes I feel a little bit cynical in the sense that, I look at, for example, the WNBA or our women's national soccer team, and the level of play is just unbelievable, and these women are just amazing human beings, and they don't get the attention or the shine, and you're just like, well, what is it going to take to kind of cross the chasm, so to speak? And on the film side, I think about Patty Jenkins and Gal Gadot, right? Because with all due respect to the Snyderverse, Wonder Woman is heads and shoulders more compelling, more fully realized, more entertaining than any other character that exists in that universe right now. And you would think they would have movies coming out every other year, a spin-off like TV series, like all kinds and you just don't see it. And so going back to this issue around, well, what does that mean for people of Latin descent? Black folks, Asian folks, people from the LGBT community, trans people living with disabilities. It's like, well, yeah, sometimes it feels like it's not looking good for the home team.
Mm-hmm.
What I will say is that, and the reason I brought up UPN and Netflix earlier is because I do feel like we get these moments when the entertainment industry expands. I'm not saying that there will always be these moments, right? That you're always going to have, constant expansion and like cyclical expansion and stuff like that. But I will say that, before the WB and UPN, there, and before Fox, like, for a lot of you young guns, the Fox network was actually a new thing for some of us. And they launched with The Simpsons and stuff like that, and they've got football, and very quickly became kind of an established player. But it wasn't always the case. When you see these new platforms emerge, again, very, very often it creates this opportunity for underrepresented groups to have their stories told. And in some cases where those projects are really successful, they can have a life of their own, and they can also help bolster the success of that platform, right? So we talk about Orange and its relationship to Netflix originals. I would say the same thing about Luke Cage and Netflix, right? Like some people who are like, well, Netflix is all right, but whatever, I don't really see it. And then they saw what Cheo Coker did with Luke Cage, and were like, all right, I'm all in, right? Because these people are able to tell stories that you just wouldn't see in other places that really hit for me. So there's this interesting dynamic that happens, and it's all good from the perspective of looking at it more, not so much as being relegated to something, but that as new platforms emerge, we have new opportunities to bring in new voices. I think that's refreshing, and one should be optimistic about that, because I think we're in this very interesting churn right now where the industry is still trying to figure itself out, and there are new platforms emerging, and I think that will mean more opportunity. You just don't want to squander those opportunities, right? And um, we got to find a way to close the circuit. And what I mean by that is just that we have had, you mentioned the Cosby Show, which started in the late '80s and had an amazing run. Girlfriends, which managed to find itself on multiple networks over time. Um, Moesha with this the star of the show is a triple threat, right? She can do lots of different things. Um, the success of those projects should tell people that they need to that a dollar invested in projects like those is likely to return more than a dollar, right? From an economic perspective, the kind of portfolio theory of entertainment, you should be thinking about, investing in some of these stories that are not told as often because you don't know what their full upside is, and investing in them to the point where the execution will be, you know, at the appropriate level, right? Um, and so I think that's more the story that needs to be told now. And it's interesting you mentioned 2020 as being an anomaly. I feel like we saw a lot of very overt commitments from the entertainment studios and other folks in the entertainment ecosystem saying that they wanted to invest in and see more of that stuff. Now, right after that, production basically shut down for a while. And so we will see if we get this kind of carry through um, where the self realization is sustained and we see more projects headed up by women and more stories that feature people living with disabilities or folks from the LGBT community or. Um, that can happen. And in many cases, we've seen a lot of projects that have been announced where it's underway. You're mentioning Dwayne Johnson earlier. I'm super excited for Black Adam. I think it's going to be an incredible compliment to Shazam. And I think what he's going to do is he's going to reach a whole new set of fans with that experience that otherwise wouldn't have even cared about superheroes and all this other stuff, um, and would have had a different take on who superheroes are for, right? Um, I'm looking forward to Issa Rae's next projects and all the stuff anything that's got Ava DuVernay's name on it. I'm here for it. Um,
Yep.
Shonda Rhimes has become a mogul, right? And in addition to the fact that you have platforms like Netflix giving people shine, you know, bringing in Eddie Murphy or Barack Obama or Dave Chappelle and so on, right? In addition to the individual projects, you also have the fact that they, with Strong Black Lead and Strong Black Legend, are using social media to highlight and celebrate these people's performances, right? So then it becomes a full 360-degree, immersion in the culture, right? That's the gold standard, right? They clearly get it and have this kind of virtuous cycle of investment. And you just hope that the rest of the industry catches on.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. One, can other platforms emulate that? And two, I was getting frustrated by the number of subscriptions I had and the number of passwords I had to remember. But you're bringing up a really good point that with all of these new platforms, we can get more stories about more people, and that will maybe boost those platforms, those subscription services to another level. So again, you've made me see the light on the pragmatic approach to racism. You made me see the light on all of these platforms and streaming services. But I agree with you. I think Netflix does a really good job, like creating a whole universe where people can engage, and they do a good job, like uplifting people like Loretta Devine or Jennifer Lewis, who have been playing grandmothers as long as I've been alive, which is unfair because they're so talented, just like across the board. So
Mm-hmm.
good. So we kind of talked about we hit the pain points a little bit as laid out by the study. Thinking back to the study, is there any stage of that process that is more damaging than others? Is it like the most damage is done at the decision phase or the most damage is done at the distribution phase? And then is there a part of this process that is easier to rectify than others?
So I would say partially it depends on what you mean by damage. I
Mm-hmm.
do think that the discovery phase question is really, to me, the most provocative.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, going back to that $10 billion number, it's very hard to assess the value of something you don't have and have never seen.
Right.
Right. So I've gotten into very interesting conversations throughout the years with companies that shall remain nameless when I was trying to pitch a university research project to study certain consumer behavior. And their argument back to me was essentially, we measure that behavior directly, um, because folks use our platform or our service or what have you. Right. And we don't need to do any kind of additional research to understand what consumers want. And it's like, well, yes, but if all you're doing is using analytics based on the stuff that people are currently consuming, how do you know about the appetite for stuff they've never seen? Right? How do you actually move to where the puck is headed if you're only looking at where the puck has been?
Right. And
So
I had that question. Sorry to
go
interrupt,
ahead.
but like, it's just, when they're building out the models and saying that these things won't perform this way in this community or this way abroad, it's like, how do you know you've never done it before? And looks like you've had those conversations. So
One,
thank you for
one,
your.
100%. And so, a case in point, the difficulties that folks had in getting Crazy Rich Asians greenlit and the kind of critical acclaim that Crazy Rich Asians received, right? Or Black Panther, which is the converse, right? So the argument about doing a blockbuster movie, what is this kind of action-packed thrillers with big budgets, if it features a nearly all black cast, right, in all the leading roles, was that it won't play in Asia, right? Increasingly in the global market, yada yada yada. Those films don't travel, and so for you to invest, 100 to $200 million plus, X amount of dollars in essentially marketing and so forth, um, you know, you're capping your ceiling because you're only going to make the money back in North America. Nobody else is really going to
Mhm.
get it or want to see it. And the reality is that Black Panther, made hundreds of millions of dollars overseas,
Yep.
right? Which in theory kind of disproves the model. Um, we don't know if other studios will follow suit or if they'll just decide that that was idiosyncratic to Black Panther because of its place in the sequence of Marvel movies, because of the cast, because of the intellectual whatever, and just say, well, that worked for them, but it would never work for another project. That's possible. It's also possible that now we've proved a thing. The thing is that the folks at Disney and specifically Kevin Feige and the rest of the crew that works on the Marvel Cinematic Universe, they rightly understood in that moment that there wasn't really a past analog to model what Black Panther could be. And they let Ryan Coogler and the creative team and the incredible cast do what they were going to do, to bring T'Challa and the royal family of Wakanda to life on screen. And they did that in such a strong way that that film actually got to reach its potential overseas,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, it is very, very difficult when we look at the going back to my point about discovery, when we look at the traditional ways of how we greenlight projects and how we source them. It's very difficult to imagine, how we're going to really radically transform the projects in the pipeline. It requires people to kind of step outside of their cultural experience and to start to understand their audiences in new ways so that they can potentially embrace projects and, more to the point, position and craft those projects so that they can be as successful as they can possibly be, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, that, I think, to me, is the most provocative piece of it all. At the end of the day, the combination of the way technology is impacting the industry and the increasingly global market for entertainment, thanks to streaming services and so on, we may find 10 years from now that, like, we're in a radically new environment because the economics have changed, the distribution models have changed, and now, like, getting certain projects on screen is trivial. We may see
Mm-hmm.
that, right? But right now where I sit, you know, what I hear more than anything else, and I would say the same thing about women trying to start up companies, is that you go and pitch and people just don't get it,
Right.
right? That's to me. So now that's damaging from the perspective of the quantity and the quality of options that people have. Um, I don't know, I work at a business school. there's a separate question about social impact and whether or not, you know, you know, what the impact of the downstream impact of representation or the lack of representation has for us as a society.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so there, you also talk about the importance of execution, not just from the perspective of how commercially successful a project is going to be, but then also the messages you send more broadly, right? So dealing with things like stereotypes and assumptions. For women appearing in movies, we have the Bechdel test, because we want to know what are the women doing in the movie.
Yep.
And I think that, at some future point, we'll have meta-analysis about like what these characters who come from underrepresented groups, what they're doing on screen and how either authentic or relevant or impactful that is. I think there's a need for that. And we may discover that even if we see more faces that look familiar, that the storytelling itself isn't up to the job. But I suspect that if we deal with kind of the having the right people in the room making decisions around what gets made and who gets to make it, some of those things will take care of themselves, I think. But I think you could ask half a dozen people and they might respond to this question very, very differently. I just think that go straight to the front end of the funnel. There's still so much untapped potential, so much. You look at Jordan Peele and what he's doing with Twilight Zone and stuff like there's so much untapped potential. Yep. I feel that that's the most provocative place to start.
Okay. That's totally fair. And I think you started kind of tiptoeing into the next subject, which is like the ongoing challenges that people face and getting more people behind the scenes, either doing the producing, the writing, the executives who are doing the hiring, stuff like that. Because a few months ago, what is time? But I think it was a few months ago that a new Netflix show came out and everybody on Twitter posted a scene of two underrepresented characters having really awkward dialogue that was not representative of like anybody's experience. If you know what I'm talking about, I'll try and find the clip and like throw it in the show notes. I'll send it to you after this, Jay. But it was bad. It was really bad. Someone called it like some weird Oppression Olympics nonsense. So I think it is really important to have those writers assistants, the production assistants, everybody, the person making the wigs. Because if someone's wig is messed up, Twitter goes to town, right? But in talking about like the ongoing challenges people face, like once the studios have bought into telling us or agreed to tell a story, right? Some of the examples the study gave were fewer at bats, stereotyped and set apart, undervalued and held back, unsupported and passed over, and then quick to be cut. And we've kind of talked about them throughout this entire conversation, but I'm thinking of fewer at bats, and I'm thinking specifically of Reggie Hayes, the guy who played William on Girlfriends, right? He's on Girlfriends for 8 seasons. He's a main character. Don't see him again until the show ends up on Netflix. And I read an article about that, and he immediately says, I can't even remember the guy's name. I wasn't Matthew Chandler from, I don't know the guy's name. I wasn't a character on Friends who people were literally writing scripts for them as soon as they stepped off the lot, right? Like he didn't have that experience. And that's a perfect example. Someone else I thought of was Leonard Roberts. He was Ali Larter's husband on Heroes. He wrote a piece in Variety a few again,
months
what
ago.
Is time? Sure, if you say so. He wrote the piece in Variety and said she was racist. Like, this is how she treated me. And then he was kind of written off as a problem. And he doesn't have like a huge career today. Would he have a career otherwise? I don't know. But like, you have these incidents in your career and you think back, if someone had treated me differently, fairly, where would I be in my career? So that's one piece. Stereotyped and set apart. I think that goes back to your comments on what's getting funded and where's it going, right? Like a really telling quote was, the studios want Wakanda or they want poverty. There's no in between. There's no room for telling different stories. And then there's no one writing those different stories. So again, I'll ask, and you might have to do the provocative thing again, but what's most important to tackle first here if you had to kind of go one by one?
So I would say that one of the things that got me so excited about Strong Black Lead was the fact that somebody out there was giving people their flowers.
Mm-hmm.
Not everybody ends up like a Will Smith. And you know, you know, I want to say this very clearly because Will Smith is an unbelievably talented human being. He's committed and really hardworking, and the success and recognition that he's gotten reflects that. He doesn't have kind of an overstated reputation.
Mm-hmm.
Will Smith can do a lot of things. And as an actor, he's really, I mean, the range of roles that he's taken on, I don't think people appreciate what he's got going for him. That said, I want to see the same kind of commensurate opportunity, compensation, respect for everybody of Will Smith's talent level and above.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We have a number of celebrities who are extremely well known within their communities, but are not, necessarily very well known across all communities. Right? One of my favorite actors on the planet is Angela Bassett, and I don't
Yep.
necessarily feel like she gets the respect that she deserves. Another,
Do you want to
Don
do an
Cheadle.
episode about getting robbed at the Oscars? Because we can put that on the calendar too.
Don't get me started. And so, yes, I think that there's this idea of kind of one and done, or where your past successes, for whatever reason, don't get to accumulate and stick to you the way they would if you were somebody representing a more well understood culture.
Yeah.
Ken Watanabe, uh, America Ferrera. I mean, there's a whole, like, these people who are just nice with theirs. Even, and again, even folks who, in my opinion, because we talk about Angela Bassett, like, there are people out there who get some shine and have made a lot of money and everything, but they still, that there's a level of success that you would expect them to have that they haven't yet achieved. Is probably a better way to put it. And
Yep.
that, I think, when you start to see that, then you start to understand all these other people who, for whatever reason, didn't, blow up, right? Like, they never made it to that next thing. When I see Paperboy from Atlanta in Godzilla versus Kong, I'm like, okay, okay.
Yeah.
Like, they gave the man a job. Good. When I see Golden Brooks from Girlfriends in an episode of Star Trek Enterprise, it's like, okay, like, that's okay. Yeah. But
We're
again,
starting.
like, right. But in many cases, there's a start, and then you don't see this arc where these people get more and more opportunities, even when they leverage them, the opportunities they have really well. Now, you also see sometimes folks kind of hit a point and then get, on a detour and then make it back. So it's not to say that Hollywood completely throws away the talent. I'm not trying to make that argument. And there have been plenty of people who still have managed to get, a decent amount of opportunity. But when you have somebody, playing a major character in a series like Heroes, feeling like he's having a hard time being recognizable, and he points to how he was kind of cut out of the marketing campaign and stuff like that. These are all decisions that people made. Somebody made those decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And they have a direct impact on his career, on his impact on the culture, on his ability to reach fans, and so on. And while nobody's entitled to be a celebrity, for sure, you want to see a little bit more equity in the way talent is treated, right? And I think anybody with two X chromosomes can tell you that, like, this is not an issue that only applies to race.
Correct. Two things. One, I think you articulated better my idea that Hollywood only allows like so many non-white actors to peak at any given moment, right? You mentioned like America Ferrera, like she was in Ugly Betty, she was in Superstore, which just ended. So hopefully she like goes on to something bigger and better next, right? You have, like you mentioned, you have people that do their thing, they peak, they kind of detour, and they come back. But again, I think it's cyclical, maybe not like a straight perfect circle, but that's my point too. Yes, this is not just erasing. This is not just a Black, Asian, Latino. It's a women thing too, and could also do an entire episode on awards that only like straight white guys have won in film. And hopefully that's changing. The Academy Awards are coming up soon. Hopefully that's changing, or depending on when this is released, they've already happened. Who knows? That said, let's get to kind of the changing of the guard and what you think that looks like. So, referring back to the study, they kind of teed up 4 things that they think could help the situation. The first is to ensure diverse representation, especially off screen. So I didn't say the numbers earlier, I don't think, but it's something like 85 to 90% of executives are white.
Mm-hmm.
The knock-on effect is that those executives get deals to produce stuff after they leave, which will feature more white people.
Mm-hmm.
We found out a few months ago the Hollywood Foreign Press Association doesn't have a single black voting member. Again, things only white men, white people have been able to do. That could be a whole episode. Something else was to increase transparency and accountability. There was a big kind of to-do a few years ago at the Academy Awards about inclusion writers, and you see those sometimes. You see different actors who have advocated to be paid the same, that their women counterparts who get paid the same amount that they do for a film or a TV series or a season. Seek and financially support a wide range of black stories. Start by committing a certain percentage of the budget to actors, producers, writers, executives, everyone in the ecosystem. And then finally, create an independent organization to promote diversity. What do you think of those? What are you doing? I know you're doing things that kind of filter into all 4 categories. So what do you think of these? What are you doing? And is there anything that was missed?
So I think that, first of all, they've, these are all the high leverage points. And there are certainly other things that people can do in the margins. But if we start from the premise that probably the most important thing is that we need to fund more projects, right? Then it follows that all those other things have to happen.
Yeah.
You have to have the transparency and accountability. You have to, be better about like having the talent involved, behind the scenes, making sure the right things get greenlit and so on and so on and so on, right? Like you have to. So yes. So what can we do? First, I think there's an issue to me around transparency around performance metrics. So, in the business world, we talk about KPIs, key performance indicators. And, it's just a fancy way of saying, like, what are you measuring? How do you know when you won? How do you know when you've been successful? Now, it's true that depending on how you see an effort or an initiative or a project or a company, you may think that there are specific metrics that are really the most indicative of your success, while, I take you to a different context and you might choose a different metric.
Mm-hmm.
That's fine. That's fine. So for the person who's like, well, I play baseball, and so, batting average or on base average is like really, really important in my sport. I got to be able to get on base as much as possible. Well, I play football, and so like the number of tackles I get, that's really how I'm measured in my position. I got to get tackles. I don't bat, so there's no bases. That's fine. But here's where it gets kind of funky. And this happens in many organizations who struggle with becoming high performance organizations. And that's when your KPIs vary based on what makes you look good. Right? So, oh yeah, we told you, back last year that we were going to be number 1 in revenue this year. And I've got some great news to report. We are number 1 in market share.
Ayo.
Right? We're number 1 in market share because we gave away the product because, we couldn't get people to pay for it. But we're number 1, right? And so, you see this kind of musical chairs happening when people, so at the underlying level, right? We talk about entertainment, which is a very unique industry because it blends business and culture. People want to be seen authentically. People want to have a voice, and they want to have an equal share in the economic upside of entertainment projects, right? That's really like, we want to boil it down to the simplest stuff. So we have to have, kind of transparency and consistency when we talk about metrics. Fair share of the upside means not that you've invested in tutoring so-and-so or training up blah, blah, blah. It's Are you actually spending X amount of dollars with vendors from underrepresented communities? Are you actually hiring X amount of people into executive roles, right? Are you actually listening to them in the meetings? Are you actually greenlighting X percentage of projects, right? So it comes down to like, are those the things you do? And it's going to be interesting to see over the next couple of years when people report back on their progress. The proof is in the pudding. Did they do the things that will actually move the needle? Um, because it's very, very easy to talk about like, supporting a cause, advertising in a newspaper in a certain month, yada, yada, yada. It's much more difficult to build, an inclusion strategy into your business model. But when you do, the upside is unbelievable.
Yep.
When you do, you see the returns that you see from a company like Netflix. So I think that transparency piece to me is super, super important, but it's only important to the degree that folks, set out some metrics by which you can measure their progress and they stick to those metrics when they report back to you.
Right.
If we're going to play musical chairs with the metrics, then I, I mean, I guess, it's fine and all, but it doesn't really, I don't think long term it's going to make the impact that people hope it will.
Sounds like how some governors are approaching COVID. Anyway, no need to name states, but I live in one. Is this enough? Will this get organizations on the right track?
One of the things there was hiring and everything, and I don't believe that there's a talent pipeline problem. I believe there's an access problem. I also think that we now live in an age, thanks to social media, where there's this organic feedback loop where when, an entertainment project or sporting event really hits, you hear the streets are talking, right? You hear back from audiences and consumers about how they feel about those things, right? And, for folks who are not as familiar with Beale Street or, we were talking about the Green Book before, or other projects, think about what happens across the interwebs with Game of Thrones or WandaVision, right? Because it's very analogous, right? So it's very easy to see when, if we're talking about Insecure or some of the other things that are more centered around Black culture and the Black community, it's very, very easy to see how they hit because you see this reaction, this visceral, organic reaction online that people have to the stories that they're seeing. And so from that point of view, I think the one extra thing that might help would be thinking about how you increase the amplitude of the audience response. And there are a couple of different ways to go about that, right? First is to actually invest in social channels, specifically with kind of reaching multicultural audiences in mind, and start to launch campaigns that are not project specific and start to build some landing places, some platforms for folks to discuss the work in a way that's much more organic and is much more democratic, small d democratic, for the communities out there, right? So that's one piece. The second piece is to think about, investing in projects where the content reflects communities whose stories aren't often told by doing if it was a TV series, right, that's like, like a streaming series would be like 13 episodes, like a regular network TV thing would be 20 plus episodes. But imagine taking resources that would have gone to an additional episode or two and creating additional content with social engagement in mind so that you're actually priming the pump to create this virtuous cycle and this feedback loop that allows more people to get included and to connect and to relate to the thing that the core thing that you're creating. You could do similar things with theatrical releases, certainly. And in fact, you see that sometimes very interesting multi-platform marketing campaigns, which sometimes tie into merchandise and other things, or you have brand partnerships, like Jeep or BMW, or I'm trying to think of some that there have been video game tie-ins and other things, but like there's a way to do that with theatrical releases as well, where you kind of try to create life beyond the thing that people are watching, to create other opportunities for people to tie in and engage and so on. But recognizing that a lot of that work should be in the service of not yesterday's conversations around entertainment, but tomorrow's, and thinking about how we engage this emerging audience, thinking about Triller and TikTok and Instagram and so on, and how we're going to make it so that um, that these works don't create barriers to entry because people don't understand the culture they emerge from, but instead that the works themselves become windows into cultures that bring people in and help them appreciate and get joy from those cultures and make them more connected, right? So that, I think, is a piece of this. Well, frankly, there's a business opportunity, like, Bon and Bao over at Triller. I don't know if you listen, but, this recommendation, like, I think platforms like yours are a great way to get people to connect directly to some of this work in a way that's authentic, enhances the experience for everyone, and makes those projects more accessible to a larger audience, right? I think that
Yeah.
is the kind of stuff that would also help, along with the things that you mentioned.
Excellent. Excellent. I have a couple more questions. Do you think the right people are reading this report?
I would say this about that. I think when reports like this come out, they get distributed very, very widely. But there's a difference between insights and actionable insights. So your thing about the right people, there's more to this, because you have to start thinking about, okay, the department heads, for example, in a studio, and what the kind of what they're trying to manage, and the time horizon around which they manage it. What's the product cycle for what they're doing? Um, and I would say that it's difficult to incorporate information like this in an actionable way, if you, for example, if you're working in marketing. And we have to make that more transparent. I think that we started with this question around, should we couch issues of inclusion, which are these kind of fundamental, like, are we good humans issues, in terms of dollars and cents, and talking about the economic imperative. And I would say that, like, we do have to think about those things in that way, not only because we want to reach people who wouldn't be reached another way, but also because telling me that you believe in inclusion is not enough. I need you to have a business strategy that can realize inclusive goals, right? And so to do
Yeah.
that, I need to be able to translate and talk about some of these deficiencies and opportunities in a way that allows people to see, okay, here's a business opportunity for us to kind of do the right thing and also benefit economically from it, right? So again, going back to the marketing analogy, maybe it's, one of the things, some inside baseball for those of you who haven't been paying attention. So in LA, we have tons of billboards that we use for promoting theatrical releases and TV series.
Yep.
However, most of them are along the drive path that many of the executives take on their way to work, right? It's not necessarily
Right.
the case that you have tons of billboards, for example, in, like, West Carson or Torrance, right? Like, that's not
Yeah.
necessarily, a place where you're gonna find a billboard.
Yep.
But those people watch movies too. They watch TV shows too. And so maybe,
Yep.
part of, like, when we see reports like this, you have a marketing person who's thinking about, okay, well, maybe we need to start rethinking our outdoor strategy and employ some different vendors. Maybe we're not going to erect billboards in some of these communities that don't have them, but how do we leverage their outdoor resources so that we're getting that same kind of exposure in these other communities, right? It's a very tactical thing, but when you take a bunch of tactical things in the service of a larger strategy, then that's where you see long-term change. And so, I guess going back to your thing, was, is the right person seeing it? I don't know. I would say you need folks to see the reports like this, who can then operationalize the insights and pitch them to their fellow stakeholders in a way that's going to, create action. And so sometimes yes, sometimes no. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so, I think one thing is that, in theory, folks who are the heads of diversity or initiatives related to diversity at the various entertainment companies. So like a Craig Robinson at NBCU, right? Part of their scope of work might need to include doing just that, being the ombudsman for these kinds of reports, and then figuring out how like this information and knowledge is being generated externally, how it translates into action internally, right? Maybe there needs to be people on those teams where that's their job. Whether you think about that as kind of organizational or leadership development, like I'm going to help make the people internally smarter, or if it's a biz dev job, like, okay, I see a thing and I'm going to use that to kind of build the appropriate relationship so we can launch the next project properly, or whatever. But I think if it's going to hit all the right people, then people need to start thinking more explicitly and conscientiously about how they source their external information and what they do with it.
I would just like to add a pitch for myself right here, and that if you need someone to do this job at your organization, I'm available. I just
Ryan's
want to throw
available,
that out
y'all.
there.
She's
I'm here.
available.
I'm here. But Jay, I want you to gas yourself up, or I want you to gas up UCLA, because UCLA is doing the work to try and rectify some of these wrongs and lower some of these barriers. So could you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeesh. UCLA is a massive institution, and we're doing a lot in the areas of social impact, diversity, inclusion, equity, social justice, and have been for decades. Right, this is the alma mater of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Jackie Robinson and Arthur Ashe, and so like, of course, UCLA is doing these things. At our little center, we have done a couple of things that we're pretty proud of. We have a partnership with Howard University, where we allow some selected students to come and take part in our summer institutes, where we cover their tuition and their housing, and we place them in internships around Hollywood. We take a certain personal point of pride that when it comes to our major conferences, like our Pulse conference, which we just had, we try to make sure that the executives that we reach out to and the creatives that we reach out to present to everybody else reflect, our larger community, and that we don't shy away from issues of diversity and inclusion. And we try to recognize folks who are out there doing things to push this conversation forward. So this year, our Game Changer Award recipient was the WNBA's Players Association, the WNBPA. And I had a wonderful conversation with Elizabeth Williams and Shanae Ogwumike, where we talked about some of the social justice stands that they took in the past. UCLA now has a center, the Skoll Center for Social Impact and Entertainment, which is run by the School of Theater, Film, and Television, right? So it's not at the business school like I am, but they do incredible work as well. We all, I think, strive towards trying to find ways and spaces where we can prepare our students, impact the community, and hopefully make the industry better at this stuff. We continue to support a number of other initiatives. And in fact, my center is going to be partnering with the city of LA on working on a session or an event that we'll be doing in May for Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, because obviously it's time for us to talk about that community as well. There's a lot going on. We do some of it. I try to make sure that our center stands up for women, but we're just one drop in the bucket. I mean, I would strongly recommend for those of you who are really interested in folks that are doing the work, in addition to the Hollywood Diversity Report, as I said, that comes out of the Bunch Center and the School of Social Sciences at UCLA. USC has a number of studies, out of Annenberg, that deal not just with, this stuff that we've been talking about today, but also women. We've got tons of organizations. So Participant Media and Hello Sunshine are actual Hollywood studios that are concerned about inclusion and social impact. You need to check for them. The Gina Davis Institute, Madeline Denono is a force of nature. And they have been totally committed to equity for women in the business. The Time's Up campaign, and on and on and on and on. So yes, UCLA, like I have an amazing team. And I think that our Center for Management of Enterprise and Media, Entertainment, and Sports, the Center for Memes, we do our thing. We do our thing, but we're just a drop in the bucket. There's so many people doing great stuff.
Agreed. But I couldn't let this interview go without you talking about the work you're doing, because I for those of you who don't know, I don't know if I've talked about it, but I finished with my MBA at Anderson, had a chance to interact with Jay, had a chance to interact with the rest of his staff, had a chance to participate in these conferences and their excellent insights and avenues into the entertainment industry that not everybody has. So I'm grateful that I had the opportunity to connect with Jay and the rest of the team while I was at Anderson. I'm grateful that we're able to share what they're doing, even if it was just a small slice of the episode. But Jay, that's it. Thank you so much for going through this study with me. Again, you opened up my eyes to a couple different things. I keep calling it the pragmatic approach to racism because I don't have like a better buzzword for it, but how we're thinking about that, how we're thinking about the solutions, how we're thinking about the entertainment industry beyond what we see on our screens. I think you did a great job providing the context to the listeners. So thank you so much. Where can we find you on the internet, or if we want to go to one of these awesome conferences you're hosting, where do we find more information?
So first of all, it's a pleasure to be here talking to you always, Ryan. Thank you for having me. If you want to get more information about what the center is doing, you can follow us on Twitter at Center for Memes, MEMES. You can follow me at Data Shogun. But I think you'll find just a simple Google search on UCLA Anderson diversity. You'll find a lot of the very, very cool things that we've been up to over the last couple of years. The work is not finished. It's ongoing. We just had on Friday yet another amazing Velocity conference, which is where we celebrate women in business. And hopefully soon you'll be able to see some of the recordings from that if you haven't had a chance to see it live. I strongly encourage you. I think in the next week or two, we'll be producing some of the recordings from our Pulse conference. So you'll actually get a chance to see my conversation with Elizabeth Williams and Shanae Ogumake. I also had an incredible conversation with Emma Ryan Yamazaki, who's a documentarian. She did a documentary about a high school baseball tournament in Japan called Koshien, which the documentary is on point.
Yes.
And we did a partnered event where we talked about an HBO documentary that's a tough watch called At the Heart of Gold, which is about the Michigan State gymnastics scandal. But we partnered with, a nonprofit here in LA that focuses on education through sports and has been working very diligently to try to educate people and raise awareness around abuse and how do we keep our players, our student athletes and athletes in general safe. And we'll probably do more with them in the future. So again, I'd say just check us out. You can follow me. You can follow the center. But I strongly recommend, there's a lot of stuff happening at UCLA right now and beyond.
Of course.
And I think there's tons of opportunity for just to raise awareness and to hopefully get you plugged in.
Awesome. Jay, thank you so much. Everybody, that's it for That Can't Be Right. Have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks again to Jay for joining me on this episode of That Can't Be Right. Check out the episode description for all the important organizations and events Jay talked about in our discussion. Tell this app to keep downloading new episodes of That Can't Be Right as soon as they release. And connect with That Can't Be Right on Twitter and Instagram at TCBRPod. If there's something that you think can't be right, send me an email at thatcan'tberightpodcast@gmail.com. And if you listen to this whole episode thinking I was going to talk about Niecy Nash, I'm so sorry. Bye.